Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today I'm going to be talking about a book that I just finished, William T. Vollmann, You Bright and Risen Angels. 1987, it was the first thing that he published. I think he was something like 26 or 27 years old when it was published, but he was like 22 or 23 when he started writing it. This is really a remarkable achievement. And it's one of those that kind of seems like it splits people down the middle. Either you like it or you really don't like it. And we have to remember that this was right there in the genesis of the maximalist novel. It's been likened a lot to Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, which came out, I think, in 1973. I think that's an ill-founded claim. I think if you just read maybe the first couple of pages, you would immediately say, oh, this is basically another Gravity's Rainbow. But if you read the whole thing, you'll find that there are, some connections to what Pynchon's doing, but this is a completely different text, completely different project, really. So, right off the bat, let's just define what we mean when we talk about the maximalist novel, because you'll see this come up with almost every review or comment on this book. I love this thin little volume of scholarship by Stefano Ercolino. This is put out by Bloomsbury Academic, and it's called The Maximalist Novel, from Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow to Robert Bolaño's 2666. And I'm not going to flip through it and read it. Luckily, I put it all down on this little piece of paper. But he sets up a framework of 10 properties of a maximalist novel that are perfect when applied to You Bright and Risen Angels. So what are we talking about here? Number one, length, because space is necessary to capture the expansive information that the author wants to include. The encyclopedic mode, and Ercolino defines this as a polemic against Jean Lyotard's end of grand narratives. Dissonant chorality, which is multiple narrators and a polyphony of contexts. Diegetic exuberance, which is basically fragments and digressions. Completeness. When he talks about completeness, he's referring to the structure, not the plot. So there's a tight structure, maybe not to the insane degree of maybe Dante's Inferno, but still there's like a geometric or formal systematic structure. Narratorial omniscience. This is a polemic against Roland Barthes, his death of the author. And in the case of You Bright and Risen Angels, the author inserts himself directly in the text. Paranoid imagination. This is a common trait of all post-war fiction. Intersemioticity, which is a modal synthesis or a combining of different media. And as Ercolino defines it, this is a way of keeping fiction relevant as technology evolves. Ethical commitment. And I don't have time to go into all the nuances of this. It's sort of a tenuous argument in my opinion, but he uses this as a polemic against the claims of self-indulgence when it comes to the maximalist novel. And then finally, hybrid realism. And this is very apparent in You Bright and Risen Angels, but this is an alternative possibility of realism. It usually has implausible, grotesque, or absurd characters and plots. So, for anybody who's even ventured to read this, you'll see that it fits quite nicely into Ercolino's framework for the maximalist novel. I highly recommend this little book. Alright, so let's talk about the author. Let's talk about William T. Vollmann at the time. He's young, he's a programmer, he's gone through this Deep Springs College, which you've probably heard about. It's very notorious, takes like 12 young men a year, and you have to work the land and so on. He's gone through that. He's now got a job in Silicon Valley as a programmer, and it's a notoriously written book because You know, he would go there and he would work all day at the computer, and then he'd stay until everybody left, and he would hide under his desk until the janitors left, and then he would basically eat candy bars and spend all night working on this novel, and then get some sleep by curling up in a sleeping bag and putting a wastebasket in front of him to block him in. He was a door-to-door pamphleteer for a little while, which features in this novel with Frank Fairless. He was a protester. He went up to Washington and protested against a nuclear power plant up there, which features in here. And during the course of writing this, or the very early stages of writing it, he paid for his own way to go to Afghanistan in 1982. And most people are familiar with his Afghanistan picture show, which he wrote pretty early on from that experience, but it wasn't published until much later, maybe 92 or something like that. Some of the themes behind this book, war, electricity, white power in the New World, and capitalism. And there's actually a humorous element to that. Mr. White ends up starting a power and electric company, and it's called White Power and Electric, which is that's a clever. And then programming features in here, though it's not deep into programming. It has some things here and there. It's more the wraparound structure that there are these two programmers. But the concept of bugs and electricity works on multiple levels. On the computer programming level, one way to think about it is that bugs arise in software, but without electricity, you would never see the bugs because the software would never run. So it's kind of an interesting take for me. Let's see what Vollmann himself said about it. This is from the Expelled from Eden reader. "That was the genesis of my character Bug in You Bright and Risen Angels. I made the bad guys as bad as I possibly could, and I made them oppress Bug himself so that he would be unequivocally in the right. But as soon as Bug began to strike back, he began to become evil no matter what I did. What You Bright and Risen Angels turned out to be was a monograph on certain experiments conducted in my ethical laboratory. Experiments involving the most powerful reagent, cruelty. Despite myself, it became my premise that cruelty corrupts its victims just as much as its perpetrators, that revolutionaries are or become as bad as their tyrants. This book is concerned with the consciousness of bugs and electricity, because a bug's life is one very practical way of surviving in a cruel world. Survival by amoral, expedient, scuttling, hiding, and attacking. And because electricity can mythically exemplify the technological forces which impel people into a bug's life." Brilliant, brilliant metaphors. And with that understanding, that's very important to take that understanding into the text. Otherwise, you just chalk it up to this, techno fable or techno allegory, and that's it. Really, what we're seeing here in this book, right at the start of his career, is his entire career in miniature. Everything that you will see in later books is in here. All the environmentalism that has recently come out in the carbon ideologies, all of the musings on ethics and morals and violence and war that came out in his Rising Up and Rising Down, where he's developing a moral calculus for when violence is necessary or justified and when it isn't. You're getting technology and how it affects people, capitalism, corporate greed and oppression, the underbelly of society, which is really a strong metaphor when we talk about bugs, because these bugs and insects, they're literally, like these beetles are literally an underbelly species, but we're also getting glimpses into the prostitutes and hobos and drug addicts and so on that will really become apparent in the next published work, The Rainbow Stories. The structure of this book is a really neat idea, and it's essentially, you've got these two programmers the author and Big George, and they are the narrators. They share this narrative all throughout. And in fact, on page 17, we see that the author is saying that Big George just doesn't care. Like, Big George is determined to lie and confuse the reader, and create anachronisms and discrepancies in place and dates. And the author says, for he just doesn't care. And all I can hope to do is to type in a little ameliorating detail here and there. So you've got these two narrators at war with each other, and what they're doing, they're getting in there and they're actually inputting into the program, and we're seeing that program play out. And notice that he's saying all I can do is hope to type in a little ameliorating detail here and there. The program is already predetermined. So this is a very deterministic world. And they'll jump ahead, they'll tell you who's going to die and so on, and that there's nothing they can do to stop it. And oftentimes the author and Big George will speak in the same paragraph, in the same footnote, and in some cases in the very same sentence, such as on page 307, the start of the chapter, Blue Globes Again. The first sentence says, I, the author, and I, Big George, were at the North Blockade that night when Wayne took Ellen out of the picture. The plot in general, I mean, there's there's a lot to talk about. It's pretty expansive, but in general, you have the computer program that Big George and the author are controlling, more or less, is basically sort of this ethical laboratory that Vollmann was talking about in what we read from Expelled from Eden. The program essentially becomes a way to see, how dictatorships arise and what happens when power corrupts and so on. And so these two groups of people clash with one another. They are the revolutionaries, helmed by Bug, at least initially, and then the reactionaries, helmed by the inventor of electricity, Mr. White, and then his sort of underling, Dr. Dodger, who invents and capitalizes just about anything you read that's a material object, that is a consumer object. And they clash with one another. And another way to look at this is that it's nature versus artificiality. There's this scene where Bug is rallying all of the revolutionaries against the inventors of electricity, and he says, which do we want, sunlight or electric light? And the audience says, sunlight, sunlight. And so, that kind of reminded me of a moment in Thoreau's Walden. I don't feel like going and finding it. I think it may be in the chapter called Sounds, but it's right there in the opening sentence, and it says something to the effect of, the sunlight will not be remembered any longer for the blinds that it streams through, or something like that. But it's basically saying, or at least I can liken that to the blinds over the window being like technology filtering in sunlight instead of just the sunlight itself. And in the same way, electricity giving us this unnatural light instead of, just being more primitive and in touch with nature. Maybe an oblique analogy, and I could have that wrong, but it's something that jogged in my memory. Let's read the opening sentence so that you can get a feel for how this works. Most of the pages are just walls of dense text, which can get hard on the eyes. But what makes it worth it is that Vollmann, even here in his first published work, is a very good writer. He knows how to keep you engaged. His sentences are hypnotic, sometimes lyrical, but they're always so compressed with information, and so well written, with always a mot juste, that you're just entranced by them. You just want to read more and more and more. So here's the opening sentence. Just because they found Martin Bormann's skull doesn't mean he's dead, my best beloved, for everyone knows that competent observers from every neutral country have reported sighting an old man in Argentina whose head is wrapped in bandages, and only the hunted eyes show, winking and blinking beneath the thousands of cranial splints. And Anastasia Romanoff, I know her. When Yurovsky and his Cheka men were murdering her family, she fainted and they took her for dead. They piled her into a truck with the others, and while they were getting the hatchets and caustic acids ready, she came to herself, ran into the deep taiga, and flung herself into the arms of the whites just in time, where she was treated as befitted her nobility, and that's how the leopard got his spots. So he uses that bathos or pathetic device to have this, end it with something like, and that's how the leopard got his spots. That isn't always the case, but that's just a taste of what's going on. And I think because of that reference to Martin Bormann, maybe that's where people read and think, oh, this is another World War II novel, like Gravity's Rainbow. But I assure you that it's very much its own thing, and it doesn't seek to recreate events and so on like Pynchon does with the Blitzkrieg on London. He really has a knack for simile and just the well-chosen words. His vocabulary is incredible. I don't know that I've ever read someone with such an expansive and diverse vocabulary. I mean, whatever the context of what he's talking about, it's like he has read every nonfiction book and every particular encyclopedia on that subject, and he's using words from that discipline. It's really something quite extraordinary. You also get these very wide-ranging and diverse epigrams, and well-chosen epigrams at that. Vollmann, as is on display in this novel, and as we'll see throughout his whole career, Vollmann has basically read everything that's ever been written, to a degree that is very rare. He doesn't just read academic books on Thomas Edison. He will go and find all of Thomas Edison's extant writings, like telegrams, letters, journal entries, and he seems to go and just absorb everything, and then he just chooses these perfect quotes for epigrams that complement the book, the narrative that he's working on. But then he'll drop in a little excerpt from the Browning gun owner's manual, or some flyer that came in a newspaper in 1984 or something like that. It's really quite remarkable. There's so much to say about You Bright and Risen Angels that I know this video cannot possibly do it justice unless I go on for hours and hours. But one thing that a lot of would-be readers want to know when they sit here and flip through this and just see wall after wall of text, which goes on for a solid 635 pages, is it worth it? Okay, the short answer for me, yes, it's worth it. I'm a fan of Vollmann. I'm coming to his work kind of late, so maybe I have more patience now, more time to read. Yes, it took me a while. I had to read this exclusively for 12 days straight, at least 2 or 3 hours a day, without any other books. Usually I'm reading 3 or 4 books at a time. It really, needed my concentration, and I knew pretty quickly that if I was going to commit to reading it, that I wouldn't be able to lit up or take breaks, because there's a lot of threads to keep hold of here. But to come down on the level of someone who's very skeptical instead of someone who's already a fan and wants to read it, I would say that, it is going to take some time. There are vast digressions. And I thought about some comments I made recently about Haruki Murakami. I was decrying one of the books because of its lengthy passages of just getting characters from one place to another. And that happens here even more expansively. And so I had to challenge myself. What is it that irritates me about that with Murakami, but doesn't with Vollmann? And again, I have to come back to how well written this is and how intelligent it is. Whereas Murakami is just going to use this bland language, take people through a tunnel or something. Vollmann is going to get down in there and really paint a picture of what it looks like, what it feels like, what it smells like. And he's going to give you these digressions and these analogies that are so sharp and so finely tuned that you can't help but appreciate him. Again, it's just his imagination is on fire. And because of that, because it's so well written, because it's so well crafted and packs so much novel information into every sentence, that's the difference for me. It's a pleasure to read it, and I really feel like I'm absorbing something and in the presence of greatness. This is an incredible first novel. As many people have remarked. Is it still relevant today? Is it still readable today? Yes and yes. It's wonderful. It's amazing that he was able to achieve this much right from the start, and he's only going to grow from here. It's also remarkable that someone who has written this work of imaginative power will go on to write these incredible pieces of immersive journalism and this long philosophical work on violence and so on. It just, you can't help but feel that because of what happened with his younger sister when he was so young and that she drowned under his watch, which he openly talks about, you can't help but link that to this meticulousness he has, where it's almost like psychologically, because that happened and he wasn't paying attention in that moment, that now he has felt like he has to pay excruciating attention to every single thing around him. And then the only outlet for that is to put it in books. But it's more than just him producing these idiosyncratic encyclopedias for us to enjoy. He's also compelled, perhaps by his time at Deep Springs, he's compelled to do something good in his life, and he has this impulsion to get out there and shed light on things like poverty and climate destruction and so on. So it's really amazing to see all of these different qualities in one person. I highly recommend going and enjoying the very beginning, the start of Vollmann's career with You Bright and Risen Angels. Thank you.